morning, everyone. Today is October 19th, 2023, and welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong Motan. Every week, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for mediators, arbitrators, lawyers, and everyone who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And so far, our audiences have been so generous in contributing in honor of our great speakers. One of my favorite parts of the program each week is when we announce the running total of just how much our generous audiences have contributed since the programs began. Jean Lawler, would you please do the honors?
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yes, indeed, it's a pleasure. The audiences, all of you are so generous. We have been told about contributions totaling, as of this point, $465,760.27. That's millions of meals around the world. What a difference we're all making. So thank you all so much for your generosity, and keep telling us what you're donating, please. Thanks so much. We'd love to add it to our running total.
That is awesome. Thank you, Jean, Natalie, and thank you so much to everyone who has spoken and everyone who has contributed. Today, we have another terrific program for you. We have David Fairman talking about mediating in a polarized society. David is Senior Mediator at the Consensus Building Institute and Associate Director of the MIT-Harvard Public Disputes Program. For 34 years, he has built consensus and enhanced collaboration capacity on complex public and organizational issues in the US and in other countries. David leads CBI's economic and social policy practice, facilitating consensus building and initiatives on economic opportunity and mobility, affordable housing, and criminal justice. He also facilitates collaboration to strengthen democracy, working with members of Congress and leaders in the movement for democratic renewal. And if David Fairman can make progress with the leaders in Congress, he can do just about anything. David Fairman, please tell us a little bit about the food bank to which you would like people to contribute if they're able, and then on with your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Natalie and Jean, and thanks to everyone who's joined and to everybody who has been joining and contributing. That is just a fantastic number that you all are generating for food banks around the country. So the one that I'm asking people to consider and generate donations for today is the Greater Boston Food Bank. And it serves Boston and surrounding communities where there is absolutely a significant amount of hunger and need, both for a historically marginalized lower income population and today for a new migrant population that is really challenged in our communities. So thank you in advance, those of you who can donate, and it'll be really helpful. Maybe I'll just pick it up from Jeff's introduction and say that any claims of success with regard to members of Congress should be taken with a grain of salt, maybe a shaker in my case, although I have had the chance to work with members of Congress, and I'll say a little bit about that. But what I wanted to do today is have a conversation together, which will start with me sharing some thoughts about where we are as a society, how we got here, and what we as mediators can do about it. So I actually do want to start, perhaps surprisingly for people who are mainly focused on process, with a fair amount of substance, because I think it's very important to understand how we got here politically and the roots of that, which are social and economic. And also to spend a little bit of time on what we think we know about public opinion today and polarization today at a broad scale, and about some of the different ways that people are trying to address that polarization in different spheres of our society and our economy and government. And then I do want to talk about some of my own experiences, humbly, but I thought might as well share some of that and offer a couple of more general thoughts from those experiences. And then finally, just talk about what might be interesting for people who are professional mediators to do in our society in the US right now. And then turn it over to you for a conversation about where we go from here. So I'm gonna just move through this. I would say, just as a kind of initial caveat, that most of what I am about to say is, I would say, broadly agreed by a community of scholars and practitioners working on issues of polarization in our society, but everything that I'm about to say is subject to interpretation and debate. So first, I just want to take a step back from today and remind us all of what those who are living and voting today have lived through in their lives since coming of age. If we start with the baby boomers, starting with folks born in the after World War II, and take it all the way through Gen X, just to remind ourselves how substantial those changes have been. I am not, by the way, claiming that these changes are the most pronounced or extreme that we've ever had as a society. On the contrary, I would say probably the candidates are people born in about 1900. They saw extraordinary changes, but these changes are significant. Just to start with the economic, globalization, from the recovery of Europe after World War II, the rise of Japan, the rise of global trade and investment, now China. Automation, don't have to say more than that, simply to acknowledge that we're talking about going from mainframes to AI on your phone. The growing advantages to capital in the world economy. Capital is mobile. Returns to capital historically have exceeded returns to labor, and the political and legal context for capital has made it possible for those with wealth to accumulate more a lot quicker than wages have risen. And then the knowledge economy that's been born out of all of these trends, and how significant that shift is, the deindustrialization of our country and the rise of knowledge work. Socially, the ongoing demographic shift that we are all living through as the population becomes increasingly non-white, and as its sort of geography shifts more south and west. The new social movements that have come and now are very much part of our social fabrics, starting with civil rights and the women's movement, the environmental movement, but now many more identitarian movements, including the conservative movement, the evangelical movement, that are very prominent in our society in a way that they haven't been. A more highly educated population overall, although a real split in how that educational opportunity is distributed. And increasing residential and virtual, that is online, segregation of our lived experience. That a mixing of races and classes, and actually especially classes, is going down. There has been actually a peak in racial integration, which is now falling back a little bit again, but segregation by economic status is actually still increasing. And then politically, just to remind ourselves that we've had two really major realignments of each party since the 1960s. The rise of the conservative movement in the Republican Party through the 1990s, and then from 2010 on, populism and nativism from the Tea Party to where we are today. The Democrats, the end of the New Deal coalition from the 1960s to the 80s, and the rise of the New Left, much more oriented toward kind of working professionals rather than the working class. And from the 1990s on, a multiracial coalition with centrist leadership. As again, broad spectrum, wave of the hand. This is what we've lived through. And to remind us also that each generation of Americans has lived through it differently. The baby boomers coming of age in the 1960s and watching the country be pulled apart and being part of that, all the way through to Gen X, born into the Reagan era when it came of age, the millennials who were born into George Bush's America and the war in Iraq came of age then, and now Gen Z trying to figure out whether climate change means that their life chances are really, really challenged. So generational perspective on these shifts really matters. But then let's go to, given those shifts, where has the polarization come from? So broadly speaking, economically, the white working class has become disillusioned with the Democratic Party. Immigration is broadly perceived as a threat to jobs by lower income workers. pervasive economic security. About 40% of Americans don't have $500 in the bank for an emergency. And another 25%, if they didn't get their paycheck, and as homeowners, they could lose their house. So this puts people on edge whenever there's an economic downturn, and it increases the sense that forces beyond people's control are driving things, and it makes them want to listen to people who tell them that it's somebody else's fault and that a different kind of leadership could change everything. And then on the flip side of that, a highly educated professional class that has become more progressive over time. And this, you really see this in the Democratic Party politics, especially. This is the story of incomes since the mid-1960s. If you're in the top 5%, you're a big winner. In the next 20%, you've done well, the top 20, including the top 5, have done well. You can see that if you're not in the top 20% of Americans, things have not gotten that much better. And if you're at the bottom 40%, they've basically not changed at all. So this notion of economic opportunity is really challenged by where we are on incomes. And if we look at that then in terms of economic mobility, the left-hand chart is the likelihood that you as an adult would make more than your parents did at the same age. So you can see that if you were born in 1940, there was an over 90% chance that by the age of 30, you'd be making more than your parents. If you were born in 1980, it's a 50-50 chance that you're making more than your parents. So the lived experience of the American dream, of each generation handing on more opportunity to the next, has been really challenged over the last, particularly over the last 40 years. And then if you look on the right-hand chart, what you see is that the likelihood that you stay where you were born, that is, you stay in your same income distribution, is pretty high. So this is the probability that if you are in the, from whatever starting place, the likelihood that you'll end up in the top 20%. So if you start in the top 20%, that's the line at the top, good odds, better than 1 in 3 that you stay there. If you're born in the bottom decile, the bottom 20%, less than a 10% chance that you move up. And then geographically also, you can see here the distribution of upward mobility. And it's clear that if you live in the Southeast, life is harder in terms of opportunity to move up. And you can see that also in the old Rust Belt, in Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, that you have a sort of a concentration of lower mobility. And then it's really interesting to see that the coasts aren't that much better. They're better, but they're not great. And that, I think it's quite interesting. It's the upper Midwest and the Great Plains down through parts of Texas where mobility is highest. Make of that what you will. But it's very important to recognize that some of the forces, the political forces that we're dealing with, very, very directly reflect the economic situation that we find ourselves in. Socially, how has this played out? Basically, what was supposed to be a meritocracy is feeling pretty hereditary, which is not the way anybody wants it to be. We've had declining trust in institutions and elites over basically the entire last 60 years, starting with the Vietnam War and up until today. Declining civic participation, greater segregation, and the cultural experience of our large cities today is really, really different from how it feels to live in a smaller town or in a rural area. And it's important to keep that in mind, because my guess is that many of the people on this call are in larger cities. And if you don't spend very much time in smaller towns or rural areas, it's easy to forget how different life is and how different people's perspectives are there on change, on values, on what's important in the community. One thing I just want to spend a minute on is the role of education and college education, which has been touted for the last 40 years as a really, really important opportunity generator. And it's true that going to college does increase your life chances for a better income, better lifetime income. That's the left-hand graph, which just shows that if you are coming from a lower income background, so the child rank on the left going up and down, the parent rank on the bottom, the likelihood that that you can advance is increased by going to college. But on the right-hand side, what we see is that the likelihood that you get to go to college, that you get that opportunity, is of course heavily based on your parents' income. So what's supposed to be the big leveler, the big opportunity generator, is increasingly tightly controlled by your parents' income. So if you're born poor, the odds that you go to college are really low. So that opportunity doesn't get generated for you. Then let's get to the politics of this. What we have seen and what we see today is the sorting of the parties by these economically and socially driven categories. The Democrats increasingly the party of professionals, of the coasts and major cities, and of identity groups. Younger, not dramatically younger, but significantly younger overall than Republicans. And the Republican coalition, small business, evangelicals, towns and rural areas, some socially conservative, people of color. It's really important to point out that it's not a lily white party, but it is definitely a predominantly white party, and that it's older, and that trend of the Republican Party getting older is increasing. So the Republican Party's base is aging faster, much faster than the Democratic Party base. When we then turn back to the map, this is just a reminder of where we were in 2020 in terms of counties and their votes for Biden and Trump, Biden in red, Trump in blue, and the sort of the vote share, the darker the red or the darker the blue, the bigger the vote share. And, you know, it's just a reminder that we really have a dramatic difference between the experience of more rural parts of America and more urban parts of America and the two coasts, especially. And you see these islands of blue dotted in the middle of the country are basically all larger cities. So that's a quick tour through how we got here and where we are. And it's, you know, perhaps not super inspiring, but it's really important to remember where we're starting from when we have a conversation about how to deal with polarization. So civility is great, but civility is not going to do the trick here. We need actually to work directly on the drivers that have gotten us to where we are today. The way that this plays out in people's attitudes and mindsets is something called effective polarization. And that means how positive do you feel toward people of the same political party, and how negative do you feel toward people of the opposite party or the other party in our system. So what you see in this graph is that people's view of their own party, the positiveness that they feel toward their own party, has been pretty unchanged over this entire last 40 years. But what's really changed is how bad they feel about people of the other party. So starting from the sort of 50 point, it's now down around 20. So it's a really significant rise in antagonistic feeling toward the other party. And that's sort of summed up in the effective polarization line. So it's a kind of a grim story, right? It would be one thing if the story was, we just feel so much better about who we are. But actually the story is, no, we really mostly feel much more negative toward the other guy. When we disaggregate this a little bit more, and this is fantastic research done by a group called More in Common, that has done some of the best polling and focus group work of anybody on the kind of American political culture that we're living in. Their analysis is not super sophisticated, but it's worth spending a minute on to point out that we've got two really strident wings in the political system right now. On the left, progressive activists making up about 8% of the voting public. And on the right, traditional conservatives and devoted conservatives. The devoted conservatives is more or less a translation of people who are really, really committed to the kinds of things that Donald Trump is calling for. And they together make up about 25% of the population. So you put those two wings together, they're about a third of the voting public. In the middle are these interesting groups of traditional liberals, passive liberals, the politically disengaged, and moderates, making up about 2/3 of the public. And what the research of More in Common has come up with is an analysis of what these people in the middle have in common. And this is what they have to say about that. That it's really important to keep in mind that 2/3 of the country, more or less, don't like what we're going through. They don't like this level of polarization. They are disengaging more and more from the political system and from being politically active because they can't control the discourse. The discourse is being controlled by the wings on both ends. They are pragmatic. 2/3 of Americans are open to the possibility of compromise with people who have very different views from they, and trying to figure out what will actually be helpful in a particular situation. And although they are disengaged and frustrated, they believe that we can find common ground. So despite this rise in polarization, it's very important to remember, and it's important for me every day to remember, that actually what we are living through is two extremes that are dominating the discourse while most of us sit it out. And that's actually an opportunity space, a place where we can work constructively. However, the challenge is to get past not only the frustration with the system overall, but the failure to recognize that people of the other party, the majority of people in the other party, actually aren't nearly as extreme as we think they are. So this is a graph of how Republicans overestimate the difference between their views and the views of Democrats. So just taking that first one at the top as an example, the question was to Republicans, do you think that most Democrats think police are bad people? Do you think that most Democrats think police are bad people? And the answer from Republicans was they thought about nearly 80% of Democrats would say police are bad. But in fact, it's less than 50% of Democrats who would say police are bad. And all the other questions are like that. They show the difference between what Republicans think about Democrats and what Democrats on average actually think. And of course, the same is true the other way around. Take immigration. Democrats were asked, do you think Republicans would agree that properly controlled immigration could be good for America? Democrats guessed that less than half of Republicans would think that's true. And in fact, almost 80% of Republicans agree that that could be true. So we have a really important challenge and opportunity in the fact that we actually misunderstand the mainstream views of people in the other party. So again, it's a gap, it's a problem, but it's also an opportunity to improve our understanding of each other. Let me then just get for a couple of minutes into this question of what can be done. And here I'm not saying anything original. I'm simply repeating the conventional wisdom of those who are trying to work on this challenge in different spheres. Clearly, it would be better to have more economic opportunity and mobility distributed more widely in our society, and especially at the bottom of our society. It would also be really good to have a news and information business that didn't depend primarily on revenue from social media, which is becoming the main way that newspapers and media outlets make money. They are in these negotiated relationships with Facebook and Twitter, trying to get a share of all the stuff that's getting reposted. And it's a really, really hard place to be. And we're losing newspapers left and right across the country. We need to get back to a structure of this industry and a business model that allows news to flourish with broader audiences nationally, and which allows for local news to survive. Because without local news, everything gets nationalized. We don't want that. We want people to actually know what's going on in their communities and be involved in their communities. Socially, civic education, lots we could say about that. Civic culture, the idea that by getting together with people who are different from us in their views and doing good things together for the community, we can actually start to reconnect as people. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that in a minute. Widening people's social networks, both place-based and virtual, trying to get out of the silos that we have good evidence a lot of us are living in. And not, by the way, to switch our point of view so that we agree with the other side. No, but to have actual understanding of what the other side believes and why, and maybe to have some exchange and interaction across those networks. And then more concretely, to have real dialogue across those differences, structured and supported. And then finally, in the political sphere, which is where the the real Mount Everest of problems sits. Electoral redistricting and changes in the way that we conduct primaries and perhaps even general elections, things like ranked choice votings, and congressional rules and culture to get us away from the situation we have now, which is two parties absolutely driven to do the worst to the other. And I'll have a little bit more to say about this. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are the headlines from people who are trying to work on addressing the drivers of polarization. And toward the end, I'll give you a website to check out if you want to, called More Perfect, which is trying to sort of bucket up several of these initiatives and support them. So then let me just talk for a couple of minutes about some things that I myself have worked on to just give flavor of what some people are trying to do on some of these problems. And then I'll go from that to a couple of more general points. But so one thing I'm working on right now is a super ambitious project to try to package up significant new agreements across 6 major issues: climate change, the healthcare system, education, economic mobility, spending, and taxes. This has never been tried before, to create a package deal that would go across all 6 of these areas. The thinking behind it is that it is more likely to get an agreement on a package across which major interest groups and political interests could trade than trying to work issue by issue. It's being supported by a small think tank and do tank called the Center for Collaborative Democracy. And right now there's an expert group of eminent economists who have actually reached agreement in principle on a starting point for then bringing stakeholders together across the country for dialogue and negotiation. Another really interesting one that I'm working on is called the Support for Working Families Collaborative, with a wonderful organization in Washington called Convergence that brings people together on national issues. And this is a group of 30 people absolutely across the ideological spectrum, from libertarians and evangelical conservatives to very progressive Democrats, trying to figure out what could be done to help families with children at the lower end of the income spectrum do better. And they're addressing child care, the sort of child allowance, the child tax credit, and paid leave, among other issues, and trying to work on, again, a negotiated agreement across those issues that would have strong enough left-right support to bring to the Congress. And these are people who are well connected to members of Congress who've been working with them for many years on different legislative packages. Some of this, of course, also can be and should be done at the state level. But this is really good work, really trans-ideological work, even though there are strong ideological differences at play. Another really interesting one is a convening on basic income. Basic income is the idea of giving everyone in the country a fixed amount of money, a modest fixed amount of money, no strings attached, on a regular basis, biweekly or monthly, to level the playing field, particularly for people at the bottom of the income distribution, to give them more economic security, to then enable them to make better choices for themselves, better in the sense of having more opportunity, more option to make choices with more of a cushion, not to be so desperate for a job that you have to take any job at any time. And here again, it's ideologically interesting, some progressive social justice people, but also some libertarians who are attracted to the idea of basic income, and people from the tech sector who are having already a lot of concern about the impact of automation and AI on our society, and recognize that they have a role and responsibility to help with it. Social dialogue about bringing people together in communities. The bridging and service idea is that across the country annually, more than 60 million Americans volunteer, almost all of it locally, almost all of it with service organizations that are themselves local, a number of them connected to faith communities. In any case, the idea here is that volunteering actually is one of the last great opportunities for people to mix, to be shoulder to shoulder with people who they don't have very strong social ties to otherwise, and may have really different views from, And there is an interest in exploring ways in which that volunteering experience, whether at the very local level or through the organized national service, could be more intentionally designed to allow people to get to know each other and to start to explore ways in which they may think differently without overshadowing the valued and preferred experience of doing the work, whether it's in a food pantry, disaster relief, tutoring after school, et cetera. And so what we've been doing with Convergence and with support from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is bringing people together who are leaders in the nonprofit volunteering community from organizations like Habitat for Humanity, the YMCAs, the Red Cross, and many local organizations to explore whether and how there are appropriate ways for them to take on some bridging opportunity without in any way diluting their core focus and mission. And it's been really productive. And we think that there are, in fact, really good insights coming out of something called contact theory, which is basically the idea that if you bring people from different views together to work toward a common goal in settings where they have equal status and support, they actually can reduce their out-group prejudice and increase their commitment to work together, not just in the context of their volunteering or their interaction directly, but start to transfer that view to other members of the group who they formerly were prejudiced against. So that's a super interesting one that seems to be getting some momentum. And then I have had the privilege over the last couple of years of working with leaders in this national bridging movement, the Listen First Coalition. I'll share some information about them at the end. This is basically the cottage industry of about 500 organizations across the country that are trying to do primarily dialogue work at the local level, sometimes at a higher level. And they're very wide variety of methods, from local town halls to a lot of work online. And they are creating more opportunities, both locally and nationally, for people to have constructive conversations across difference. And I think there are opportunities for mediators to play a bigger role in that movement. I'll say a bit about that later. Finally, a shout out in the political domain to the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship, where I did a little work to help them think through what it means to have a more constructive civic culture of democracy. And that commission which was commissioned by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, came out with a report called Our Common Purpose that became the basis for this organization, More Perfect, to advance work on the major institutional challenges that we face around things like the size of Congress as well as its rules, but also civic education and civic culture. And finally, I want to acknowledge, as Jeff mentioned at the outset, that I and others did some work with members of Congress in 2021 after the events of January 6th to help them deal with the trauma of their experience of that day and how difficult the experience was making it for them to work with members of the other party. We worked in particular with the Bipartisan Working Group, which is a small and hearty group of legislators from both parties in the House. And we also worked with the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which is also a very constructive bipartisan committee, which is aimed at creating a better working Congress, including working across partisan lines in the Congress. And I'll just say about that last one that it was a humbling experience in the sense that these members of Congress are people too. One of them talked about the experience of being called on the day after, on January 7th, getting calls from the half of her family that were from her party, but not from the relatives who were from the other party, and how incredibly difficult that was for her. Another person talked about death threats that his family continued to receive for weeks after January 6th and how difficult that was. So there was some really direct sharing of people's personal experiences. And what we I should say that what we were trying to do there was first allow people to share how they experienced that day. Second, how the experience of that day was shaping their view of how to work together across partisan lines. And third, to give members of each party an opportunity to acknowledge what they had heard from members of the other party without in any way suggesting that they needed to agree with anything that they had heard, simply an opportunity to acknowledge in the sense of, I understood you and I understand how and why you feel the way that you do. And then finally, to talk together about how they could move forward with the work that they were trying to do together, given the dialogue that they had had. And I will say that it was effective. It cleared the air in a constructive way. It made it possible for the co-chairs and the members of those, the bipartisan working group and the select committee to move forward. And of course, it did not resolve any of the underlying challenges that they continue to face around partisan division. But it was a demonstration that on some of the most difficult issues, a little bit of structure, a little bit of support for constructive dialogue can really change the frame in which members of Congress work together. There are several ongoing initiatives to try to do more of that work informally with members of Congress in safe settings. It is very, very difficult to get this to happen with members of Congress. It is very important to get it to happen. And I am cautiously optimistic, although it may have to get worse before it gets better. Let me just step back from those examples for a minute and say that a couple of things that aren't rocket science, but I think are important to name. One is, let's not think that partisanship and polarization has totally eclipsed interest-based negotiation. It absolutely hasn't. There's plenty of good work getting done at every level, from local to national, that we and others as mediators and facilitators are involved in, that is very constructive interest-based negotiation on everything from citing wind power to figuring out how to build affordable housing. So we are still capable of good constructive negotiation on the basis of material and social interests. But it is certainly true that partisan identities are more often dominant in this public consensus building and conflict resolution work than they were in my earlier career, in up until the 2010s. And that because that's true, that connecting on a personal level is really, really important. It's always been important, but now I would say it's truly essential for making progress on these issues. And it's a different skill set, of course, than interest-based negotiation to orchestrate personal relationship building and connections. And it's a very significant part of the work that we do now in a way that it wasn't before. Maybe that was our problem to begin with, but in any case, we're really very intentional now about creating opportunity for relationship building. And then I think on a positive note, we don't, honestly, there's nobody who we've been working with on local, state, or national issues over the last several years, including some of the most fiercely ideological, who we think is out to wreck the country. Nobody's out to wreck the country. Everybody's trying to make the country better. And most of them are willing to work with people that they disagree with to do that work. Although, of course, we're biased in our sample because we get the people who are willing to come to the table. But my point is that this is a country filled with people of goodwill and good skill who can work together on hard issues across difference. And we mustn't lose sight of that. It's very important to keep the message going along with the actual work, not to lose hope in our ability to work together. We absolutely can do it. We're still doing it. We'll do more of it. I want to just end by abstracting slightly from what I've been talking about and offering a framework that I would say certainly is not exclusive to highly polarized issues, but is useful for us to use at CBI, my organization. And negotiation, that quadrant at the lower right, is of course central to the work that we do. But in the upper left, the trust building, as I mentioned, has become much more important. And the bullet pointed things are different tools that we think we can use to help with that. Storytelling and acknowledging history is really important and valuable. And we do a lot of that, having people start off early in the process at the first meeting talking about some of their life experiences that are relevant to what we're working on together, and very much personalizing it and giving that space and time in a way that we wouldn't have 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. And doing explicit perspective taking exercises where we actually ask people to say back what they think the other person just said, in order to give the opportunity both to demonstrate, yep, I got it, I heard it, and to give the person who is being reflected back to the opportunity to recognize, okay, they really did. Creativity, always important, but especially important when the issues seem so polarized and stuck. Should the child tax credit be a universal benefit for every family, or should the money be targeted only to those with the lowest incomes? It's a challenging question. It's a deeply ideological question. And there are ways to think about targeted universalism here, where everybody gets something, but people at the bottom get more. And you can play with different frames around that to figure out if there's something negotiable. We like to maximize brainstorming time early in the process because we want to get a bunch of different ideas out there, and we often will do it by first creating a principle level framework, things that we agree on. So in the case of working families, agency for families, meeting basic needs, 2 core principles that everyone agrees on, and then see whether we can be creative in thinking of options within that framework. And then finally, just to say joint action. That is, yes, we want people to sit around the table and do good work together there in constructing things. But we have found more and more that it's very helpful, even from fairly early in the process, to get them to start trying to do things in the world together, whether it's joint fact finding, to actually go out and assess, well, what are the possibilities for, again, in the context of working families, what do we know about the ways in which childcare can be delivered differently around the country, and have them share information on that, because they often fight about those facts, and creating a space where they can do the fact finding together is really helpful. Communicating jointly about the group's work in process is a big trust builder. If you can find a way to have a press release talking about the work in midstream in ways that everyone is happy to go public with, that can be a really big win. You have to be careful about the timing of that and the content of it, but there are definitely things that are worth doing together that show the group's work in the world and not just around the table. So again, there's a lot more to say about this framework. I would simply say that these 4 building blocks are like ingredients or even food groups for a great meal. What you as a chef have to do, or as a cook, maybe the less glorious term, is figure out what's the right blend and in what sequence of these elements for the particulars of this group and this issue set. But I think it's clear to us that these 4 quadrants have to work together, and that, again, increasing our emphasis on trust building and on joint action is often a good idea. Couple of thoughts for you, and then I'm going to stop and you're going to talk. There's lots that mediators can do as citizens in your communities, in our communities, and you don't have to formally say, I'm a mediator to do this well. You have the skills to do this, and you can contribute. As practitioners, in your formal capacity, yes, I think, of course, I am living proof, and I'm sure a number of other people on this call are too, that you can take on a role on public issues. Just don't think that that's where the big bucks are, but it's absolutely a role to consider if you're someone who has an appetite to do more in the public arena. Think about trying to do some mediation work on public issues. And then as a professional community, I just think we actually do have a lot to say about good process for dealing with public issues. Whether and how to speak with the one voice, I'm not saying that the Alliance for Conflict Resolution or any other mediation organization should be taking stands on all the issues of the day. But I think there may be times when at the federal or at the state or even at the local level, a group of mediators might want to say, we have some thoughts about how to make this process work better. That could be legitimate. And I'm ending with just noting, if you are interested in getting involved more in a local context, the website citizenconnect.us has many, many opportunities to research organizations and activities that are bridge building that you can do. The Listen First Coalition is that cottage industry of 500 organizations around the country. If you look there and you see an organization of interest to you to maybe get involved in as a volunteer, that could be great. And then if you want to learn more about what's going on at the national level, to try and advance some of the really tough institutional challenges that I mentioned, you can look at the website joinmoreperfect.us. It's a really good synthesis of the problems and the work that's being done. And now let me stop and give it to you. I'm curious what others think about in terms of what the polarization challenges are, what you think needs to be done, and what you think we as mediators in particular could do to help. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
David, that's a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. I know we're going to have some questions. I'm going to start out with a couple. One is that we all come to our work with our own identities and our own assumptions and our own backgrounds, which may influence how we deal with these various issues. How do you approach the question of your whatever biases you may have and whatever influences your own background may have on you, and how do you work to keep those in check to make sure that you are doing this good work in a truly even-handed way as objectively as you can?
Yes, it's a wonderful and a very fair question. A couple of things. One is that because we always start by talking with people individually before bringing them to the table, I and my colleagues get really well educated on the range of perspectives, and we attempt, and I think often succeed in taking a quite empathetic stance toward each individual that we talk to. So by the time we get to the table, we already have in our heads and in some ways in our hearts all those perspectives to recognize and to give respect to. And I'm not saying that I don't have biases. I absolutely do. I have actually very strong views on many of the issues that we work with, but most of my strong views are shaped by what I think could work for nearly everyone. That's what I start to feel passionate about. What do I think might actually work for nearly everyone? I tend not to hold on very strongly to a view that doesn't respond to that frame, because I'm really interested in workability. There are issues that I probably would not want to work on, and I have said no to working on some issues because without getting into it, that's not something I want to help make happen. So there is also choice about what you work on, and I think that's really important. And we as an organization, the Consensus Building Institute, have a values statement about what we're trying to do in our work. So most of our values are process values that about inclusion and effective participation and representation. We want to make sure that happens. But we also stand for sustainability. So, there's some issues out there that, again, we probably wouldn't work on just because we don't think they're going in the right direction. So, and then finally, when I feel myself starting to lean in a direction because of my own convictions, I've got to be able to recognize that, note it and stop it, because that's not my job in these situations. And that's, basically Dan Goleman's, it's a version of emotional intelligence. I think it's emotional intelligence applied to the substance of the issues and the stakeholders.
And you mentioned picking the issues on which you work. Most of us are not lucky or unlucky enough to get to work with Congress and organizations like that. We work with situations where, for example, an employment discrimination dispute. We may have an employee from one stratum of society and the employer, a large organization. We may have people from very different strata of society there, along the lines of the dimensions that you described earlier in the presentation. When we're working in these personal kinds of disputes and we recognize, okay, we've got a blue-collar worker, a college-educated employer, what are things that we can do as mediators to make sure that we are being helpful to everybody in those situations?
Yeah, I mean, there I think you're getting at something pretty fundamental, I guess, Jeff, which is humanizing each other to each other. And I see a chat, a comment in the chat about this too, that we all need to bring to situations of difference where difference may be perceived as threatening or, better than, worse than, more than, less than. We need to bring to those situations a sort of fundamental commitment to each other's humanity. And where we as mediators are having a hard time doing that, or we've recognized that one or more of the parties are having a hard time doing that, we need to find an appropriate way to raise the question, who are we here? And I think I would only say that situationally, first, I have not faced that level of challenge very often, but I think when it occurs, the better way that I found to handle it is on one-on-one basis with the person or people who I perceive as having a challenge, and to enter those conversations very humbly and offering my perception, what I believe I've observed as a dynamic, but inviting them to say how they see it and give their perspective before going into any kind of problem solving. I'm not sure I'm being responsive, Jeff, but I do think there's something really basic that you're pointing to about humanity and mutual respect. And I think those are, to call those ground rules is not quite right. They have to be core values that animate the work.
And does that require the people to look each other in the eye, or is that something that a mediator can do just as effectively through a shuttle diplomacy, shall we say?
I think it generally is a good idea to start shuttle, although one stakeholder may directly confront another. And if that happens with you present, you have to figure out, how am I going to actually support this to be a constructive confrontation? But I think shuttle is generally the lower risk way to get a good result. And then to end the shuttle by bringing them back together with an opportunity to reframe the way that they interact, and how explicit you are about that reframing is a case-by-case judgment. Sometimes it may be better to just let them demonstrate through their own actions and statements that they've changed. Sometimes it's actually helpful to say, so based on the conversations that we've each had separately, I thought it might be helpful to start by just inviting each of you to say a little bit more about how you would like to see this proceed from here, with any reflection on how it has been going. Something like that. It's just a question of what's going to be most helpful in the particular situation, in my experience anyway.
Sarah Cohn, you've been waiting very patiently to ask a question. Please unmute yourself and go ahead. You need to unmute yourself. Sarah, you're on mute. And you...
Yeah, thank you. I said thank you for attributing patience to me. How do you know I've been patient? But I have felt patient, because this is very interesting. So I missed the first 2 minutes of your talk, Dave, and I think you were not at the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation Conference this past weekend. Is that correct? It
wasn't, and I should have put NCDD on that list as well, Sarah. So please feel free, put it in the chat, etc.
Well, I will, and I just want to say I was there. This is a coalition of organizations, projects, efforts, movements that are so many of the ones you mentioned, that are people all over the country trying to develop models of practice that initially it started with a focus on dialogue and deliberation. But in these times, the entire 3 days, what permeated this conference were the questions you're asking. Like in this particular moment in time, it feels like we need to take stock of some significant changes to the landscape in which we're working. And I wish you had been there. And I think you would, the way that you have answered a critical question coming from the other perspective of saying, okay, I'm not traditionally from a dialogue background. I'm traditionally from a consensus building background, but this is where I see we need more dialogue work. And now spending 3 days in the dialogue and deliberation sphere, where they're saying we really need to do kind of more direct action against this fabric dissolving that's happening. there's such tremendous potential to kind of bring those universes together. So anyway, I just wanted to add to your list and put on everyone's radar screen the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. I encourage everyone to join the organization and get plugged into so many minds that are thinking on all the topics you just talked about, which it was tremendous to me. And I really appreciate you, David.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you so much for raising up NCDDS. Absolutely.
Thank you. David, let me ask you about Congress. We like these programs to be timeless and evergreen rather than of the moment. And yet Congress does seem to be particularly dysfunctional right now with at the moment, the inability to elect a Speaker of the House, everything from what is the dress code in the Senate to all other issues. If you were czar of the universe and you could make some rules for Congress, what would you do?
So I will shamelessly steal and try to acknowledge from others' good ideas. There is a group called, I think it's called Fix Us, and another called Issue One, both of which are working on congressional reform. And there are also recommendations on congressional reform in the Our Common Purpose report. But let me just say three things that I think could help. One is members of Congress actually getting to know each other as people, something that since the 1990s has really disintegrated. Say what you will about back rooms and cigar smoke, there was a lot of benefit from people actually knowing each other as people. And the way that Congress works now, the way that the party leaderships work is designed to keep them apart. And I think that things like going on visits to each other's districts, having a Thursday happy hour, which is deliberately bipartisan and mixing it up every week, there's a long list of things in the category of helping members of Congress get to know each other. The second is regular order. So regular order is limiting the power of leadership to firmly set the agenda of every single issue every single time and make ad hoc decisions about what comes to the floor and in what ways. More regular order would be good because it would allow more members of Congress to have more voice. And I say this would be good because the leadership is driven by the wings. That's just the way it's working right now. The Democrats a bit less so than the Republicans, it's true, but both are really heavily driven by the wings. And regular order gives more opportunity for more different kinds of issue to come to the floor, both in the House and the Senate, although I think it's more important right now in the House. And the other would be to change the way elections happen. I mean, open primaries are a really good idea. Nonpartisan redistricting is a really good idea. The places that have it show good results. Same with ranked choice voting, good idea. It's just that those institutional reforms are really, really challenging to get done. The states themselves, as we all know, are highly politicized in the way that they operate in deciding how voting works. But those changes could make a big difference in changing the incentives for members of Congress from the extremes toward the center.
Okay. Thank you. What a stimulating, fabulous presentation, David. So happy to have you as our guest here on the New Possibilities.
My pleasure. Hey, Jeff, just a super quick question. People are asking whether they can have the slides. I think my answer to that is sure, but I have no idea how to get them to them.
Natalie, what do you suggest?
David, if you send the slides to me, I will post a link for them on our Will Work for Food website.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff and Natalie and Jean and everybody for the chance. And, you know, I want to acknowledge that I am sure there's like 30 more fantastic ideas out there that we didn't get a chance to get to. And I just really encourage you all to get engaged in civic life to the extent that you're not already, because the country needs you. So thanks again.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. People who are in a position to contribute, we urge contributions to the Greater Boston Food Bank in honor of David Fairman and his wonderful presentation today. I know Natalie will post that in the chat. Once again, Greater Boston Food Bank, gbfb.org. I believe. Thank you all once again, and with that, we are complete.